Welcome back to CTN. I'm your host, Robert Van Sluten. This episode, we're going to talk about view attributes. Let's get started. What I have on the screen is a single view iPhone project. I'm going to select the background view, and I'm going to go over and look at the attributes. I can change the background color. Change it to black. And that changes the background color property of the view. Take a look at some of these other attributes here. Keep in mind that the view is really a quasi-control. It can take user input, touches. You can disable that with this checkbox here. And there is the notion of multiple touches. In other words, multi-finger gestures can be enabled or disabled. Now there is the concept of a tag, and that's an integer value that you can assign to the view or a control, because controls are views. They're subclasses of views. And that comes into play if you have multiple views or controls causing one action to take place, and you want an easy way of determining which control was touched. And the most typical way is to just if on the tag or use a case switch. We're not going to talk about any of the attributes that relate to size parameters or resizing, because that's a later subject that we're going to get into when we start talking about rotation, auto layout, auto sizing, so on and so forth. There is this notion of alpha, and alpha is transparency. But before we go there, I'm going to scroll down in the library. You'll see that there's a whole bunch of different kinds of views that serve different purposes. And there's a set of gesture recognizers. Now, gesture recognizers are something you can attach to a view to process touch inputs. I'm going to grab a view. I'm going to drag it in. I'm then going to resize it. We now have a subview of the background view, and you notice the color is white. That's the default color for the background color for a view. We're going to go ahead and we're going to play with its alpha value. Now, a 1 is opaque. In other words, there's no transparency. And there is an opaque flag here. That's just an efficiency indicator indicating to the system that the view is opaque, and it makes things run a little bit faster. I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to change this value. Let's go down to 0.5. And you'll notice that it is showing up as gray because it's translucent. You're seeing through it to a degree, and you're seeing the black background. Now, we're actually going to run this in the next slide very quickly, but I want to mention a few other things. We're not going to talk about the graphics context at all. That's a drawing thing. That comes later on. There is this notion of clip subviews, and we're going to be exploring that in a demo later on. Let's go to the next slide and actually just execute this. I went ahead and ran the app in the simulator, and you'll see the same thing that you see in the storyboard. It looks like a gray view, but it's really because of the alpha. Now, as a general rule, alpha, other than 1, is fairly intensive in graphics processing, and you should use it sparingly because too much of it could actually slow down your application. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about the subview clipping. All right, once again, I'm taking a look at the view geometry application that I demoed in the last episode. I modified this application and I added a switch that enables me to turn on and off subview clipping. Now let me show you what that is. If I increase the size of this rectangle and I rotate it, you'll notice that it actually draws outside of the super view. And you're allowed to do that. However, if you change the property that we had mentioned, you'll get clipping. And it'll clip off anything that's outside of the subview. Now the question is specifically, what is the property in UIView? Well, if we take a look at the documentation, it's called clips to bounds, and it's a bool. Yes, no. And the switch just simply sets it to yes and no. I want to go to the next slide, and I want to mention one more thing in the simple app that we were looking at before. Alright, we're back in the original project. There's just one last thing. There's a button down in the lower left-hand corner of the storyboard. And that brings up this pane here, which shows you what is referred to as the document outline. And if you look at this, you'll see the view hierarchy. There's a view and then a subview. There's some other things here which really aren't all that important at this point. The first responder is not really particularly relevant, at least in iOS. There is this notion of exit, which is used when you're doing segues with storyboarding. We're going to be talking about that later on. And then the view controllers indicated. And there's some layout guide information. But the main thing I want to point out is that the view hierarchy is displayed here, and you can actually manipulate it in this pane. That's it. Thanks for watching.